They thought I was poor, naive, and had nothing but love for their son. The worst part is that I let them believe it because when a family thinks you have zero value, they show you their true selves. Tonight, walking into my fiancé's villa, I was not just observing, I was collecting evidence. They have no idea that the girl they despise is the one who will end it all. My name is Elena, and standing before the mahogany double doors of the Sterling estate, I looked exactly like the mistake they feared their son had made. I had spent the last 3 hours curating this precise level of inadequacy. My dress was a sensible, floral print I had purchased off a clearance rack for $19.99. It was made of a polyester blend that did not breathe, and the hem fell to an awkward length just below my knees, signaling neither fashion nor allure, but simply existence. My shoes were scuffed flats, comfortable and worn, the kind of footwear used by someone who walks to the bus stop, not someone who steps out of a limousine. I wore no jewelry other than a thin, tarnished silver chain that looked like a high school graduation gift from a decade ago. I had even allowed my hair to frizz slightly in the humidity, pulling it back into a low, messy ponytail that screamed fatigue rather than effort. To the naked eye, I was a woman who was trying her best but failing to meet the standards of the elite. To the eyes waiting behind those doors, I was a liability. I reached out to press the doorbell, feeling the cold brass against my fingertip. The sound echoed deep within the house, a heavy, melodious chime that seemed to last for 10 seconds too long, beside me. Julian shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He adjusted his silk tie, his knuckles white as he smoothed the fabric. He did not look at me. He looked at the door, his jaw set tight. "Do you have everything?" Julian asked, his voice tight. I patted my small, faux leather handbag. "Just my phone and wallet," I said, smiling a smile I had practiced in the mirror. Wide, eager, and just a little bit desperate for approval. He nodded, but he did not smile back. There was a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. Despite the cool autumn air, Julian was a man who thrived on approval, and bringing me here, in this state, was an act of rebellion he was already regretting. I could feel his embarrassment radiating off him like heat from a pavement in July. He wanted to love me, or at least, he wanted to love the idea of saving me, but the reality of presenting me to the people who controlled his trust fund was sobering him up rapidly. The door swung open. It was not a servant who greeted us, but the matriarch herself. Mrs. Sterling stood framed in the doorway, a vision of carefully preserved aristocracy. She was wearing a cream cashmere sweater that likely cost more than the car I claimed to drive. Her trousers were tailored to the millimeter, and her diamonds were understated but massive, the kind of wealth that whispers so it forces you to lean in to listen. "Hello? Mother?" Julian said, stepping forward to kiss her cheek. She accepted the kiss without returning it, her eyes already traveling over his shoulder, locking onto me. It was a physical sensation, that gaze. It felt like a scanner at a grocery store checkout, reading the barcode of my existence and waiting for the price to flash on the screen. "And this must be Elena," she said. Her voice was pleasant, melodic even, but the temperature in the entryway seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Hi, Mrs. Sterling," I said, extending my hand. "It is so nice to finally meet you. Julian talks about you all the time." She looked at my hand for a fraction of a second too long before taking it. Her skin was dry and cool. She did not squeeze. She merely held my hand as if it were a dead fish she had been asked to dispose of. "Welcome to our home," she said. We stepped inside. The foyer was cavernous, dominated by a crystal chandelier that hung like a frozen explosion above our heads. The floor was marble, polished to such a high sheen that I could see the reflection of my scuffed shoes with humiliating clarity. The air smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax. It was a beautiful house, objectively speaking, but it felt like a museum where the exhibits are watched by armed guards. There was no warmth here, only the preservation of status. As we walked toward the living room, I watched Mrs. Sterling's back. She walked with a rigid posture, her spine a steel rod. I caught the way she glanced at the portrait on the wall, an oil painting of Julian's grandfather, as if seeking strength from the ancestors to deal with the intruder in her home. Julian fell into step beside his mother, leaving me a pace behind. It was a subtle shift, a realignment of loyalties before we had even sat down. He began talking about traffic, about the drive, filling the silence with nervous chatter. He was not protecting me. He was apologizing for me. We entered the drawing room, where the rest of the family waited. The room was a study in beige and gold. Mr. Sterling sat in a leather wingback chair, reading a newspaper on a tablet. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his eyes were dismissive behind his rimless glasses. "Father, this is Elena," Julian announced. Mr. Sterling lowered the tablet. He looked at me, blinked once, and gave a curt nod. Elena. There was no hug, no warm handshake, no welcome to the family, just the acknowledgement of a name. I sat where Mrs. Sterling gestured, a stiff armchair that faced the sofa where she and her husband sat together. A united front. Julian sat on the edge of the sofa near them, not next to me. The physical distance was only 3 feet, but the emotional distance was measured in tax brackets. "So, Elena," Mrs. Sterling began, crossing her legs elegantly, "Julian tells us you work in administrative support?" I folded my hands in my lap, adopting the posture of a chastised schoolgirl. "Yes, ma'am. I work at a logistics center, mostly data entry and filing. It is honest work." There was a silence, the kind of silence that usually follows a funeral announcement. "Honest, indeed," Mr. Sterling murmured, though the word sounded like an insult in his mouth. "And your family? Where are they from?" "I am from a small town in Ohio," I said, keeping my voice soft. "My father was a mechanic. My mother stayed home to raise us until she got sick. They are both passed now." I saw Julian wince. He hated this part of my story. He had tried to coach me to embellish it, to say my father owned the garage, to say my mother was a private tutor, but I had refused. I told him I could not lie about the dead. "I am sorry to hear that," Mrs. Sterling said. Her tone was devoid of empathy. It was merely the correct social response. "It must have been very difficult for you, navigating the world without resources." "We made do," I said, offering a small, brave smile. "We had a lot of love." Mrs. Sterling's lip twitched. It was a microscopic movement, a suppression of a sneer. To people like the Sterlings, love was what poor people used to justify their lack of assets. They viewed it as a consolation prize for failing at capitalism. I watched them catalog me. I could hear the calculations whirring in their heads like hard drives. Education? Community college? Unfinished? Assets? None visible. Connections? 0. Potential for social climbing? Negative. I was being ranked, scored, and failed in real time. They were looking at my hands, rough from what they assumed was manual labor. They were looking at my skin, checking for the glow that comes from expensive facials and organic diets, and finding only the pallor of fluorescent office lighting. The maid entered with a silver tray of tea and porcelain cups. The china was delicate, almost translucent. I hesitated when taking my cup, letting my hand tremble slightly. "Careful," Mrs. Sterling warned sharply. "That is Limoges. It has been in the family for 80 years. "Oh, I am so sorry," I stammered, gripping the saucer with both hands. "I will be very careful." Julian looked at the ceiling. He was ashamed. He was ashamed of my clumsiness, of my poverty, of the fact that I did not know what Limoges was. He was remembering why he usually dated women from his own circle, women who knew how to hold a teacup and how to conduct a conversation about equestrian sports or charity galas. But that was exactly why I was here. Years ago, my grandfather, a man who built an empire from dust and blood, a man who taught me everything I know about the nature of power, sat me down in his library. The room smelled of old paper and tobacco. He told me that if you want to know who a person really is, you do not look at how they treat their equals. You look at how they treat the waiter. You look at how they treat the janitor. But most importantly, he said, you look at how they treat the person they think they can use. Be the person who has nothing. He had told me, his voice rasping with age, wear poverty like a cloak, because when people think you are powerless, they stop pretending. They take off their masks because they think you are too weak to hurt them, and that is when you see the monster underneath. I was seeing the monsters now. They were not shouting or throwing things. They were polite. They were civilized. But their cruelty was woven into the very fabric of their etiquette. It was in the way Mr. Sterling asked about my rent, implying it must be a struggle. It was in the way Mrs. Sterling asked if I had ever traveled abroad, knowing full well the answer was no, just to watch me admit it. Have you ever been to Europe, Elena? She asked, sipping her tea. We spend our summers in Como. The light there is just exquisite in August. No, ma'am, I said, looking down at my shoes. I have never had a passport. I have never really left the tri-state area. Julian cleared his throat. Elena is saving up, he said, trying to salvage the moment. We were thinking maybe next year we could go somewhere. Mrs. Sterling laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound, like ice hitting glass. Oh, Julian, you are so sweet. But travel is expensive. Darling, you have to be realistic about compatibility. The word hung in the air. Compatibility. It was a code word for tax brackets. It was a polite way of saying that a golden retriever does not mate with a street rat. I looked at Julian. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for him to say that my character mattered more than my bank account. I waited for him to say that he loved me because I was kind, or smart, or resilient. But he didn't. He just took a sip of his tea and nodded vaguely. Well, we are just seeing how things go. Mother, just seeing how things go. That was the knife in the gut. We had been together for 2 years. He had proposed in private 3 days ago, but here, in the court of his parents, I was a trial run. I was a temporary lapse in judgment. I took a sip of my tea. It was bitter. They thought this was an interview. They thought they were the ones conducting the assessment, deciding if I was worthy of entry into their fortress. They were looking for cracks in my armor, flaws in my pedigree. They did not realize that I was the one holding the clipboard. I looked around the room, noting the details. The vase on the mantel was Ming Dynasty, but it was placed too close to the sunlight, which would fade the glaze over time. Amateur mistake. The rug was an authentic Persian silk, but there was a faint stain near the corner that had been aggressively scrubbed, likely with the wrong chemical agent, damaging the fibers. The financial papers Mr. Sterling had been reading on his tablet. I had caught a glimpse of the header before he lowered it. It was a bankruptcy restructuring proposal for a shell company. They were projecting strength, but I could smell the rot. I smiled at Mrs. Sterling, a shy, naive smile. You have a beautiful home, I said softly. It must be wonderful to live in a place where you never have to worry about anything. Mrs. Sterling preened. We have been very blessed, she said, but maintaining a legacy requires a certain caliber of person. It is not for the faint of heart. I understand, I said, and I did. I understood perfectly. This was not just a meet the parents dinner. This was a stress test. They wanted to see if I would break. They wanted to see if I would crumble under the weight of their condescension, so they could sweep up the pieces and throw me in the trash. They saw a girl in a cheap dress who was out of her depth. They saw a victim. I set my teacup down on the saucer with a gentle clink. I kept my posture slumped, my eyes wide and innocent. Inside, my mind was sharpening a blade. If they believe I have nothing, I will let them show me how they treat someone who has nothing. The transition from the living room to the dining hall felt less like a movement between spaces and more like a transfer from a holding cell to a courtroom. The dining table was a vast expanse of dark, polished mahogany that could easily seat 20 people, yet there were only 6 of us. Mrs. Sterling had orchestrated the seating arrangements with military precision. She and her husband sat at opposite heads of the table, commanding the terrain. Julian was placed on his mother's right. and I was placed on her left, directly across from him. This meant I was not only separated from the one person I knew, but I was also positioned perfectly to be scrutinized by the entire family without any physical shield. To my left sat Victoria, Julian's older sister, who had arrived 10 minutes prior with a whirlwind of expensive perfume and the kind of aggressive energy that sucks the oxygen out of a room. She was beautiful in a sharp, predatory way, with cheekbones that could cut glass and eyes that assessed my net worth the moment she walked in. Next to her sat a man introduced only as Uncle Arthur, a graying, silent figure who seemed more interested in his scotch than the conversation. Dinner began with a soup that looked like green sludge, but likely cost $40 a bowl. I picked up my spoon, conscious of 5 pairs of eyes tracking the movement. "So, Elena," Victoria started, not bothering to look up from her soup. "Mother tells me you work in a warehouse?" "It is a logistics center," I corrected gently, keeping my voice level. "I manage inventory data." "Right," Victoria said, finally glancing at me with a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "Boxes. Moving boxes around. That must be fascinating. I suppose someone has to do the grunt work so the rest of us can get our packages on time." I felt a flush of heat rise up my neck, but I forced it down. "It is actually quite complex." I said, "We handle supply chains for 3 states. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat from the end of the table. He sliced his bread with unnecessary force. "And did you go to university for that?" I recalled Julian saying something about community college. "Yes, sir." I said, "I attended Riverside Community College for 2 years. I had to stop to work full-time when my mother got sick." "Mr. Sterling hummed, a low, vibrating sound of disapproval. "A pity. Education is the foundation of character." "Julian." "Of course. Graduated summa cum laude from Yale. We have always believed that where one studies dictates who one becomes." I looked at Julian, waiting for him to interject, to say that intelligence isn't defined by a diploma on a wall. He kept his eyes on his soup bowl, stirring the green liquid methodically. "Everyone has a different path, Father," Julian said softly, almost to the soup itself. It was a defense, but it was so weak it felt like an apology. The main course arrived, rack of lamb with a reduction that smelled of rosemary and old money. As the servants placed the plates, the conversation shifted, or rather, it was steered by Mrs. Sterling like a weapon. "You know, Julian," Mrs. Sterling said, picking up her wineglass, "we ran into the Whitakers last weekend at the club. They asked about you." I saw Julian stiffen. "Oh, how are they?" "They are wonderful," she said, her eyes flickering toward me to ensure I was listening. "Isabella is back from Paris. She just finished her master's degree in art history at the Sorbonne. She looked absolutely radiant." The name dropped onto the table like a grenade. Isabella. I knew the name. She was the ex-girlfriend, the one who fit the mold, the one whose family owned half of the downtown real estate. Victoria laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Oh, God. Remember that summer in Martha's Vineyard? Isabella tried to teach Julian how to sail, and he almost capsized the boat. We laughed until our sides hurt. She was always so much fun, so full of life." I sat there, cutting my lamb into tiny, manageable pieces, feeling invisible. They were talking about a ghost, conjuring her spirit to sit at the table and replace me. She was very talented, Mr. Sterling added, taking a sip of red wine. "A brilliant pianist, and she spoke 4 languages, didn't she?" 5, Victoria corrected. "She picked up Italian last year." I looked at Julian again. This time, I didn't just wait. I willed him to look at me. I willed him to say that Isabella was the past, and I was the present. I willed him to reach across the table and take my hand. Instead, Julian offered a nostalgic smile to his sister. "Yeah, she was quick with languages. She was always smart." The knife in my hand scraped against the porcelain plate, a harsh screech that made everyone jump. "Sorry," I whispered. My hand slipped. "You really must be careful." "Elena," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "These plates are imported. I am just feeling a little overwhelmed. I said, playing the part of the fragile, out-of-place girl. It is just so impressive. All of this, and hearing about Julian's friends, they sound so accomplished. Victoria leaned forward, her elbows on the table, violating etiquette just to get closer to her prey. They are accomplished. Elena, that is the point. Julian is used to being surrounded by excellence. It pushes him to be better. We always thought he would end up with someone who challenged him, someone who could stand beside him at the gala, not someone he has to explain. The room went silent. The air was sucked out of the space. It was a direct hit. She hadn't just insulted me, she had called me a burden. Julian finally looked up. Victoria, that is not fair. It is honest, she shot back. We are family. Julian, we tell the truth. You can play dress-up with this girl all you want, but do not bring her to Sunday dinner and expect us to pretend she fits in. Look at her. She is terrified of the silverware. I lowered my head, letting my shoulders slump. I bit the inside of my cheek to summon tears, making my eyes glassy. I wanted them to see the defeat. I wanted them to think they had won. I am sorry, I said, my voice trembling. I know I am not what you are used to. I just love Julian. Mrs. Sterling sighed, a long, weary exhalation that sounded like a tire deflating. Love is a lovely sentiment, dear, but love does not manage a portfolio. Love does not navigate social seasons. Love does not protect a legacy. You seem like a sweet girl, really, but you have to ask yourself if you are being selfish. Selfish? I asked, blinking rapidly. By holding him back, she said efficiently, you come from two different worlds. Eventually, gravity will take over. He will resent you for not understanding his life, and you will resent him for leaving you behind. It is a kindness, really, to admit that now. I looked at Julian. He was pale. He looked from his mother to me, and for a moment, I saw the struggle in his eyes. But then he looked down at his plate again. Maybe we should talk about something else, he muttered. He gave up. He folded. In the face of his mother's velvet-wrapped cruelty and his sister's open hostility, the man I thought I loved, the man who had whispered promises of forever in the dark of my tiny apartment, had turned into a coward. He was not protecting me because, deep down, he was afraid they were right. He enjoyed the rebellion of dating me, but he did not have the spine to claim me. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. It wasn't the coldness of sadness. It was the icy clarity of a judge passing a sentence. I had come here suspecting his family was the enemy. Now I realized the rot had spread to Julian too. From the corner of my eye, I caught a movement. Uncle Arthur, the silent observer, had stopped eating. He was watching me. He wasn't looking at my cheap dress or my messy hair. He was looking at my eyes. His expression was unreadable, but for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of amusement, or perhaps recognition. He wasn't participating in the slaughter, but he was watching the blood spill with the keen interest of a scientist. I decided to push back, just a fraction, just enough to see if Julian would wake up. I may not speak 5 languages, I said, raising my voice just enough to be heard clearly over the clinking of silverware, but I know how to be loyal. I know that when you love someone, you do not let people humiliate them, not even for a rack of lamb. Victoria scoffed. Oh, spare us the melodrama. This isn't a soap opera. This is reality, and in reality, pedigree matters. Does it? I asked, locking eyes with her. Or is that just what you tell yourselves to feel better about never having to earn anything on your own? The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Sterling's fork hovered halfway to her mouth. Victoria's jaw unhinged slightly. Julian kicked me under the table, hard. Elena, he hissed. I recoiled, acting the part of the girl who realized she had spoken out of turn. Oh my gosh, I am so sorry. I do not know why I said that. I am so nervous. Please forgive me. Mrs. Sterling placed her fork down with a definitive clatter. I think, she said, her voice like liquid nitrogen, that we will have coffee in the parlor. This dinner has become indigestible. As we stood up, The humiliation hung on me like a wet coat. But as I walked behind them, watching Julian rush to pull out his mother's chair while leaving me to manage my own, I knew one thing for certain. They weren't just mean, they were strategic. They were trying to break me psychologically so I would leave on my own accord. They wanted me to feel so small that I would slip through the cracks in the floorboards and disappear. They thought they were dissecting a frog. They didn't realize they were poking a sleeping dragon. And Julian? The man who was supposed to be my partner? He was just another obstacle, a weak link in a rusted chain. As I passed Uncle Arthur, he murmured something so low I almost missed it. "Careful, girl," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "The wolves are hungry tonight." I paused and looked at him. I gave him a quick, terrified nod, playing my role to the end. But in my head, I answered him. "Let them eat." I thought, "They will choke on the bones." The heavy oak door to the dining room clicked shut behind me, sealing the toxicity of the Sterling family inside. I had excused myself, murmuring a polite request to use the powder room, and Mrs. Sterling had waved a dismissive hand toward the West Wing hall. I walked down the corridor. The house was aggressively silent. It was the kind of silence that money buys. Thick walls, plush carpets that swallowed footsteps, and an air system that hummed so quietly it felt like the house was holding its breath. I walked past the powder room. I had no intention of going in there. My bladder was fine. My instincts, however, were screaming. I needed to know the layout. I needed to know the exits. But mostly, I needed to know what they said when the charity case left the room. I reached the end of the hallway where the corridor branched off into the library and Mr. Sterling's private study. I had noticed Mr. Sterling excuse himself moments before I did, claiming he needed to take a call from Tokyo. Julian had followed him a minute later, supposedly to check on the vintage Scotch selection. I pressed my back against the damask wallpaper, sliding into the shadow of a large grandfather clock. The door to the study was ajar, leaving a gap of perhaps 2 inches. A beam of yellow light sliced across the dark hallway floor. I stopped breathing. I concentrated. The voices drifted out, low and urgent. "Are you sure she suspects nothing?" That was Mr. Sterling. His voice lacked the pompous drawl he used at dinner. It was sharp, jagged with stress. "She is clueless." "Father?" Julian's voice. My stomach turned over. It was not the voice of the man who whispered sweet nothings to me. It was the voice of a co-conspirator. "She thinks I am embarrassed by her. She thinks this is just a standard class clash. She has no idea about the timeline." "Good." "Mr. Sterling snapped. "We cannot afford any hysterics. Not with the auditors coming in 10 days. I froze. Auditors? 10 days? My mind raced, accessing the mental database of financial regulations I dealt with in my real life, the life they knew nothing about. An audit for a private family empire usually meant one of 2 things. They were selling or they were drowning. Given the tension at dinner, I was betting on drowning. "But what about the engagement?" Mrs. Sterling's voice joined them. She must have slipped in through the connecting door from the parlor. "If we announce it this weekend, it buys us credibility. It shows stability. The banks will back off if they think Julian is settling down with a safe, domestic choice. It screams austerity. It screams, we are cutting back on the extravagance." I put a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. I was not just a girlfriend they were ashamed of. I was a prop. I was a strategic maneuver. They were using my poverty to signal to their creditors that the Sterling family was becoming fiscally responsible. "Look, our son is marrying a nobody from Ohio. We are done with the yachts and the models. We are serious people now." "And how long do I have to keep it up?" Julian asked. He sounded bored, annoyed, even. 6 months, Mr. Sterling said, "just until the merger with the Vanderhoven Group is finalized. Once the ink is dry on the acquisition and their capital flows into our accounts, we will have the liquidity to pay off the bridge loans." "And then?" Julian asked. "Then you break it off." Mrs. Sterling said simply. Her tone was as casual as if she were discussing throwing out wilted flowers. We will give her a settlement. $50,000 should be more than enough to silence a girl like that. To her, that is a fortune. She will take the money and run back to her trailer park. $50,000. The number hung in the air. They valued 2 years of my life, my heart, and my dignity at $50,000. I own a handbag worth more than that. The insult was so profound it almost made me laugh. But what if she fights it? Julian asked. Mr. Sterling let out a dry, cruel chuckle. Fight with what? She has no money. She has no connections. She is stupid. Julian, we saw her at dinner. She was trembling over a teacup. She is weak. She is the perfect prey because she does not even know she is being hunted. I closed my eyes. The pain I expected to feel, the heartbreak of hearing the man I loved call me stupid, did not come. Instead, a cold, crystalline clarity washed over me. The fog of romance evaporated instantly, leaving only the hard edges of reality. I was not a person to them. I was a line item in a fraudulent business strategy. Is the Vanderhoven girl ready? Julian asked. The name clicked. Vanderhoven, old Dutch shipping money, billions in assets. Sophia is waiting in the wings, Mrs. Sterling assured him. She understands the game. She knows you need this. Little interlude to clean up your image before the merger. She is currently in Milan, but she will be back for the summer season. By then, Elena will be a distant memory. I can hardly wait. Julian sighed. God, having to listen to her talk about her logistics job is mind-numbing. She actually thinks she is smart. Father, it is pathetic. I have to nod and smile while she explains inventory spreadsheets like she has discovered fire. That was the kill shot. That was the moment Julian died to me. There was no coming back from that. He wasn't just a weak man bowing to his parents. He was mocking my intellect, the very thing I had suppressed to make him feel big. He needed a naive girl because a smart woman would terrify him. Make sure the ring is flashy. Mr. Sterling instructed. We want the press to pick it up. Sterling Heir chooses love over money. It is a great headline. It will drive the stock price up at least 5%. I stepped back from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs, not from fear, but from adrenaline. This was not a family drama. This was corporate fraud. They were manipulating stock prices and deceiving creditors using a sham engagement, and they were using me as the face of the lie. I had come here thinking I was fighting for respect. I realized now I was standing in the middle of a crime scene. They were broke. That was the secret. The Limoges china, the Ming vase, the cashmere sweaters. It was all leverage. They were likely leveraged to the hilt, borrowing against assets they no longer owned, shuffling debt from one shell company to another, and the audit in 10 days was the guillotine waiting to drop. Unless they pulled off this merger, and they needed me to secure the merger. I was the linchpin. If I walked away now, their narrative of stability collapses. The banks get nervous. The audit finds the holes. The Vanderhovens pull out. The Sterling empire crumbles into dust. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the grandfather clock. I didn't see the poor, naive girl anymore. I saw the CEO of a private equity firm that specialized in hostile takeovers. I saw a predator who had just found a wounded animal limping in the woods. They called me stupid. They called me easy to control. I fixed a loose strand of hair, tucking it behind my ear. I smoothed the wrinkles in my cheap polyester dress. I turned around and began walking back toward the parlor. I did not run. I walked with the steady, rhythmic pace of an executioner climbing the scaffold. I would not expose them tonight. That would be too easy. That would be emotional. And as they said, emotions are for poor people. I would say yes to the proposal. I would wear their ring. I would play the part of the blushing, grateful pauper. I would let them parade me in front of the cameras. I would let them build their entire financial future on my narrow shoulders. And then, when the stakes were highest, when the Vanderhovens were at the table and the auditors were watching, I would shrug. I reached the parlor door and paused. I forced my breathing to shallow. Terrified gasps. I widened my eyes until they looked moist and vulnerable. I clasped my hands together in a gesture of anxiety. I pushed the door open. Mrs. Sterling was already back on the sofa, pouring coffee as if she hadn't just plotted the destruction of a human being. Julian was standing by the fireplace, looking noble and bored. "Oh, there you are, dear, Mrs. Sterling said, offering me a shark-like smile. "We were worried you got lost in the big house." I smiled back, a tremulous, shy smile. "I did get a little turned around," I said, my voice soft and airy. "It is just so big. I cannot imagine how anyone manages it all." Julian walked over and put an arm around my waist. His touch made my skin crawl, but I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "Do not worry, babe," he said, kissing the top of my head. "You have me to guide you." "Yes," I whispered, looking up at him with adoration. "I am so lucky. I do not know what I would do without you. Julian." I felt him relax. He signaled to his father over my head. A tiny nod. "She bought it. She is ours." "Mr. Sterling beamed. "Well then, now that we are all here, Julian has something he would like to ask you. Elena." The trap was set. They thought they were the hunters. I took a deep breath, preparing to give the performance of a lifetime. "I am ready," I said, and I meant it. The atmosphere in the drawing room shifted the moment Mr. Sterling gave that imperceptible nod. It was as if an invisible director had called for action on a movie set. The aggressive interrogation of dinner and the palpable disdain of the last 2 hours evaporated, replaced instantly by a suffocating, manufactured warmth. The lighting seemed to dim, or perhaps it was just the way Mrs. Sterling positioned herself near the table lamp, casting a soft, benevolent glow over her sharp features. Julian took my hand. His palm was damp, to a romantic. This sweat would have signified the nervous anticipation of a man in love. To me, knowing what I now knew, it felt like the cold clamminess of a man trying to defuse a bomb. He led me toward the center of the room, positioning us directly in front of the grand marble fireplace. The logs were crackling, a perfect, cozy backdrop that I suspected had been lit by the maid exactly 5 minutes prior for this specific purpose. "Elena," Julian began, his voice dropping an octave to a tone I am sure he practiced in front of a mirror. I looked up at him, keeping my eyes wide and trusting. I let my shoulders hunch slightly, maintaining the physical language of the overwhelmed, grateful girl from Ohio. "Since I met you, everything has changed," he continued. He squeezed my hand, but his eyes did not lock with mine. They focused somewhere on the bridge of my nose, a technique taught in public speaking courses to simulate eye contact without actual engagement. "You ground me, Elena. In a world that is so loud and chaotic, you are quiet, you are simple, you remind me of what actually matters." I almost admired the script. It was clever. He was using my alleged poverty and lack of sophistication, the very things they mocked privately, as the virtues that made me the perfect wife. He was spinning my lack of social standing into a narrative of moral purity. It was the perfect story for the press. The prodigal son settles down with the humble girl. It screamed stability. It screamed fiscal responsibility. Victoria was standing by the piano, holding her phone. I noticed the camera lens was already aimed at us. She was not witnessing a family moment. She was documenting evidence for the shareholders. "I do not want to spend another day without you," Julian said. He took a half step back and slowly sank to one knee. The movement was fluid, choreographic. The room went silent. The only sound was the popping of the firewood and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I could feel the tension radiating from Mr. and Mrs. Sterling. They were not holding their breath in anticipation of my answer. They were holding their breath in fear of their financial ruin. If I said no, the merger failed. If I said no, the auditors would find the rot. If I said no, the Sterling empire would collapse before the fiscal quarter ended. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a velvet box. He snapped it open. The ring was absurd. It was a yellow diamond, easily 6 or 7 carats, surrounded by a halo of smaller white diamonds. It was not a piece of jewelry designed to be worn. It was a piece of jewelry designed to be photographed. It was gaudy, ostentatious, and desperate. It was the kind of ring a man buys when he needs to prove he has money, not when he actually has it. It likely cost a fortune on credit, or perhaps it was a family heirloom they had pulled out of a vault, leveraging the past to secure the future. "Elena, will you marry me?" Julian asked. I looked down at him. For a fleeting second, I allowed myself to remember the first time I met him. I remembered the coffee shop, the way he had laughed at my joke, the way he had seemed so different from the other men in suits. I realized now that the man I had met never existed. He was a projection, a mirage created to hide the emptiness inside him. I looked at the ring. It glittered violently under the chandelier. This was my exit ramp. I could say no. I could turn around, walk out those double doors, get in an Uber, and never see these people again. I could go back to my quiet life, my real job, and leave them to be devoured by their own greed. But that would be too kind. If I walked away, they would just find another girl. They would find another Sophia, or another naive victim to prop up their failing dynasty, and they would continue to live in this house, sneering at the world, believing they were untouchable. No, walking away was not justice. Justice was staying. Justice was watching the light leave their eyes when they realized who they had actually let into their fortress. I let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. I saw Mrs. Sterling's fingers tighten around the stem of her wine glass. I saw a vein pulse in Mr. Sterling's temple. Panic was beginning to claw at their throats. They were terrified I was too stupid to understand the cue. I brought my hands to my face, feigning shock. I forced a tear to well up in my right eye, a trick I had learned during a tough negotiation seminar years ago. "Yes," I whispered, my voice choking with fake emotion. "Oh my God. Yes, Julian." The relief in the room was a physical gust of wind. Julian let out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. He grabbed my hand and shoved the ring onto my finger. It was too big, sliding loosely around the base of my knuckle. A perfect metaphor. We were a mismatch in every way. He stood up and pulled me into a hug. His body was stiff. There was no passion, only the rigid satisfaction of a man who had just closed a deal. "She said yes," Victoria announced, her voice shrill. She immediately began typing on her phone, likely captioning the photo she had just taken. "She said yes. Sterling engagement, true love." "Mrs." Sterling rushed forward, her face arranged into a mask of delight. "Welcome to the family, Elena." She embraced me. Her perfume was overpowering, smelling of tuberose and cold ambition. She patted my back, but her hand did not touch me with warmth. It patted me like one pats a well-behaved dog that has just performed a trick correctly. "We must celebrate," Mr. Sterling declared, moving immediately to the wet bar. He pulled out a bottle of Dom Perignon. I noted the label. It was a vintage year. They were drinking their inventory, consuming the assets because they had nothing else left to celebrate with. The cork popped with a sharp retort, echoing like a gunshot in the high-ceilinged room. Mr. Sterling poured the champagne into crystal flutes. "To Julian and Elena," he toasted, raising his glass, "to a future filled with prosperity." Prosperity, not love, not happiness, prosperity. "To prosperity," I echoed, taking a sip. The champagne was crisp and cold. It tasted expensive. It tasted like victory. "Let me see the ring," Victoria demanded. Grabbing my hand, she inspected it, not with the joy of a future sister-in-law, but with the critical eye of an appraiser. "It is stunning. Julian, really, it catches the light perfectly." "It is a bit heavy," I said, acting shy. "I am afraid I might lose it." "Oh, you will not lose it," Mrs. Sterling said sharply, her mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "We will have it insured immediately, and resized. We cannot have it slipping off." "No, we cannot," I agreed. The next hour was a blur of staged joy. Victoria directed us to stand by the window, then by the fireplace, then sitting on the sofa. She took 50 photos, instructing Julian to look at me, instructing me to look at the ring. "Chin down, Elena. Look grateful," she directed at one point. I obeyed. I lowered my chin. I looked at the ring. I looked grateful. But inside, my mind was racing, cataloging everything. I noted that Julian's hands were shaking as he held his glass. I noted that Mr. Sterling checked his phone every 3 minutes, likely waiting for news from the Asian markets. I noted that Mrs. Sterling was already on a call in the corner, her voice low. I caught snippets of her conversation. "Yes, it is official. Just now, yes. We will release the statement tomorrow morning. No, she is a lovely girl, very humble. Exactly what Julian needs. Yes, send the press kit to the Journal." I stood there, sipping their champagne, wearing their ring, listening to them sell me to the public. They were so confident. They looked at me and saw a pawn. They saw a quiet, poorly dressed girl who was overwhelmed by their magnificence. They thought they had secured their bridge loan. They thought they had saved their legacy. Julian walked over to me, refilling my glass. He looked smug. The fear from the hallway had vanished, replaced by the arrogance of a man who believes he has pulled off the perfect crime. "You made the right choice, Elena," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "You are going to be very happy. We are going to take care of you." He emphasized the word care in a way that sounded like custody. "Thank you, Julian," I said, smiling my sweet, naive smile. "I really do not know what I did to deserve this." He smirked. "Just be yourself, babe. That is all we need." I took another sip of champagne to hide the cold smile that wanted to form on my lips. He had no idea. If he knew who I really was, if he knew that the logistics girl was actually a forensic accountant who had dismantled companies 3 times the size of Sterling Industries, he would be on his knees for a very different reason. They thought they had trapped me in this engagement. They thought they had locked me into a cage of social expectations and gratitude. But as I looked around the room at their smiling, predatory faces, I knew the truth. They thought I was trapped, but actually, I had just unlocked the door, and I was already standing inside the vault. The days following the engagement blurred into a montage of performative happiness. To the outside world, I was the luckiest girl in the city, displaying a diamond the size of a skating rink and hanging onto the arm of a Sterling heir. But inside the walls of their estate, where I was now spending nearly all my time under the guise of wedding planning, the air was thick with duplicity. I began to study Julian with the same forensic intensity I used to deconstruct fraudulent tax returns. I watched the way he tilted his phone screen away from me when a notification chimed. I tracked the micro-expressions of annoyance that flickered across his face when I asked him simple questions about our future. The man who had once brought me wildflowers picked from the side of the road, a gesture I had thought was romantic and grounded, was now revealed to be a man who simply didn't want to spend money on me. It was Wednesday, 3 days after the proposal, when the veneer of his late nights at the office finally cracked. He told me he had a strategy meeting with the board. He said it would run until midnight. He kissed my forehead, his lips dry and perfunctory, and told me not to wait up. I did not wait up. Instead, I opened the laptop he had graciously loaned me to browse flower arrangements. He thought I was looking at peonies and lilies. He had no idea that I had spent the last 48 hours quietly mirroring his cloud data. He assumed that because I worked in logistics and came from a poor background, technology was magic to me. He didn't know that tracing digital footprints was the first thing you learned when hunting embezzlers. I saw the calendar invite. It wasn't a board meeting. It was a reservation at Le Jardin, a French bistro on the north side of the city, a table for 2. I didn't call a cab. I didn't scream. I borrowed the housekeeper's old sedan, which she let me use to run errands because the big cars make me nervous, and drove there myself. I parked across the street and waited. At 7:30, Julian's Porsche pulled up. He didn't get out immediately. He checked his hair in the rearview mirror. He looked nervous. He looked eager. It was a look I had never seen him direct at me. With me, He was always calm, always slightly superior, but here, in the dim light of the street lamp, he looked like a man desperate to please. A woman stepped out of the bistro to greet him. It was Isabella, the ex-girlfriend from the dinner conversation, the one who spoke 5 languages, the one who belonged. I watched through the rain-streaked windshield as Julian hurried around the car to embrace her. It wasn't a friendly hug. It was a desperate, clinging embrace. He buried his face in her neck. She pulled back and said something, looking angry, and he grabbed her hands, pleading. I rolled down my window just an inch, though I was too far away to hear them. I didn't need audio to understand the scene. He was explaining the plan. He was telling her that I was just a temporary inconvenience, a necessary pawn to secure the family fortune so he could eventually be with her. He led her inside, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. I sat in the dark car, the engine idling, and felt a sensation I hadn't expected. It wasn't heartbreak. Heartbreak implies that something real has been broken. This was more like the dull ache of a phantom limb. I realized, with a sickening jolt, that I was grieving a man who had never existed. The Julian who listened to my stories about my childhood. He was gathering data to mock me later. The Julian who said he preferred my natural look to heavy makeup. He was ensuring I looked plain enough to lower his parents' expectations. The Julian who held my hand during thunderstorms. He was just practicing his role. I had fallen in love with a reflection in a mirror, and now the mirror was shattered. I drove back to the estate in silence. When I walked into the guest suite, I didn't cry. Tears are for loss, and I hadn't lost anything valuable. I had simply discarded a delusion. I went back to the laptop. If he was going to use me as a financial shield, I was going to make sure I knew exactly what I was shielding. I bypassed the flower arrangement tabs and went straight into the family server. I had guessed Mr. Sterling's password on the second try. It was his own birthday followed by the year the company went public. Narcissists are incredibly predictable security risks. The documents I found were damning. The Sterling Empire was a house of cards held together by illegal bridge loans and offshore shell companies. I found transfers of funds that made no sense. Money moving from the charitable foundation into private accounts in the Cayman Islands. I found invoices for consulting fees paid to companies that didn't exist. And then I found the email thread between Julian and his father. Subject: the wedding timeline. Father: Julian had written, Isabella is getting impatient. Are we sure 6 months is enough? Once the Vanderhoven merger clears, can we accelerate the annulment? I do not think I can stomach playing house with the peasant for that long. Mr. Sterling's reply was brief. Stick to the script. If she gets suspicious, buy her something shiny. Poor people are easily distracted by objects. Just keep her quiet until the audit is over. I stared at the screen. The peasant. I felt a cold rage settle in my stomach, heavy and solid like a stone. They didn't just want to use me. They wanted to erase me. I heard a noise behind me. I snapped the laptop shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. I spun around. Uncle Arthur was standing in the doorway. He was holding a tumbler of scotch, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his tie loose. He looked like a man who had been drinking since noon, but his eyes were sharp. You are digging in the wrong folder, he said. His voice was gravelly, worn down by years of smoke and silence. I froze. I opened my mouth to stammer an excuse, to play the confused girl trying to find wedding venues card. Save it, he said, walking into the room. He didn't look at me. He walked to the bookshelf and ran a finger along the spine of an old encyclopedia. I have seen you look at the financials on the news ticker. I saw you counting the staff during the party. And I saw you flinch when Victoria mentioned the market crash. You are not a logistics clerk. Elena, or whatever name you are using. I stayed silent. If I denied it, he might expose me. If I admitted it, he might expose me. He turned to face me. Why are you here? I stood up, dropping the act. My posture straightened. The fear left my face, replaced by the cold professionalism I wore in the boardroom. They are going to ruin people. I said, it is not just about me. They are leveraging assets they do not have. When this crashes, It is going to take down vendors, employees, investors, innocent people. Arthur took a sip of his drink. He grimaced. They have been doing that for 40 years. My brother has a talent for spending money that belongs to other people. Why haven't you stopped them? I asked. He laughed, a bitter, wheezing sound. Because I am the black sheep. I am the one with the drinking problem. No one listens to the drunk uncle. He gestured with his glass toward the laptop. But they might listen to an outsider, especially one they underestimate so severely. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. He tossed it onto the bed. It landed on the silk duvet with a soft thud. What is this? I asked. The real books, he said, not the ones on the server. The server has the sanitized versions they show the auditors. That drive has the shadow ledger, the bribes, the laundering, the truth about where the pension fund actually went. I looked at the drive, then back at him. Why are you giving this to me? Arthur looked tired. He looked at the family portrait hanging on the wall. Julian, his parents, and Victoria, all smiling their shark-like smiles. Because, he said softly, I remember what it felt like to be the person they thought was disposable, and because I want to see the look on my brother's face when the house finally burns down. He finished his drink in one swallow. Be careful, girl, he warned, turning to leave. They are desperate, and desperate animals bite. He walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. I sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the flash drive. It was cold in my hand. It was light, weighing almost nothing, yet it contained enough explosive material to level a dynasty. I had everything I needed. I could take this drive, walk out the front door, and go straight to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I could end this tonight. I could disappear into the night and watch the news tomorrow morning as the police cars swarmed the driveway. I could be safe. I could be free. But then I thought about Julian. I thought about him holding Isabella's hand in the bistro. I thought about the email calling me a peasant. I thought about the way his mother looked at my shoes. I thought about the $50,000 they planned to throw at me like hush money. If I left now, they would go to prison. Yes, but they would still believe they were better than me. They would believe they were just unlucky, that they got caught by a system, not by the stupid girl they mocked. I didn't just want them to fall. I wanted them to know who pushed them. I wanted to stand on that stage at the engagement party, under the crystal chandelier, and look Julian in the eye as I tore his world apart. I wanted him to see the peasant holding the executioner's axe. I closed my fist around the flash drive. I looked at the ring on my finger. It sparkled in the dim light, a symbol of their arrogance and my shackles. I am not leaving, I whispered to the empty room. I am going to finish this. The silver flash drive Uncle Arthur had tossed onto the duvet sat next to my laptop like a loaded weapon. I waited until the house was completely silent, until the heavy footsteps of Mr. Sterling had ceased in the hallway, and the distant sound of Victoria arguing on the phone had faded into nothingness. It was 2 a.m. The estate was asleep, confident in its security systems and its high walls. They did not realize the threat was already inside, sitting cross-legged on the guest bed wearing oversized pajamas. I plugged the drive into the USB port. My screen blinked, and then a folder appeared. It was simply labeled Archive. I opened it and began to work. For the next 4 hours, I was not Elena, the poor girl from Ohio. I was not the naive fiancé overwhelmed by the splendor of the Sterling lifestyle. I was a forensic accountant with a decade of experience in dismantling corporate fraud. I was a surgeon, and the Sterling family finances were the patient on my operating table. To the untrained eye, the spreadsheets would have looked like chaos. Thousands of rows of transaction data, balance sheets, and profit and loss statements spanning 15 years. But to me, they were a map. Every number told a story. Every decimal point was a footprint. I started with the accounts payable. This is usually where the bodies are buried in a dying company. I filtered the data for recurring payments over $10,000. I found a pattern almost immediately. There was a vendor listed as Apex Strategic Consulting. They were billing Sterling Industries for management advisory services every month like clockwork. The amounts varied slightly to avoid detection by automated flagging software. $42,000 one month, $38,500 the next. I cross-referenced Apex Strategic Consulting with the State Business Registry. It did not exist. I checked the routing number for the wire transfers. It led to a bank in the Cayman Islands known for its privacy laws and lack of cooperation with American tax authorities. I pulled up the invoices. They were generic, no itemized hours, no specific consultants named, just a flat fee for services rendered. I ran a search for the incorporation documents of Apex. It took me 40 minutes of digging through international shell company registries, but I found it. The signatory for the account was not a consultant. It was a holding company based in Delaware, and the owner of that holding company was listed as R.S. Holdings. Richard Sterling. My future father-in-law was not just managing a failing company, he was actively looting it. I sat back, the blue light of the laptop illuminating the room. Mr. Sterling was terrified of the audit not because it would show incompetence, but because it would show theft. He was siphoning millions of dollars out of the company, likely preparing a golden parachute for himself while leaving his son and the shareholders to crash and burn. Julian thought he was saving the family legacy by marrying me and securing the merger. He did not know that his father was already packing his bags. I dug deeper. I looked at the inventory reports. The logistics center where I claimed to work dealt with physical goods, so I knew exactly what to look for. The Sterling reports showed massive assets in raw materials, steel, lumber, precious metals, but when I cross-referenced the shipping manifests with the storage facility invoices, the numbers did not match. They were paying for storage on empty warehouses. The assets listed on their balance sheet, the assets they were using as collateral to get loans from the banks, did not exist. They were ghost assets. They had inflated their value by nearly 40% to keep the credit lines open. This was not just bad business. This was federal prison time. This was the kind of fraud that destroys lives, wipes out pension funds, and lands people on the front page of every newspaper in the country. Then I found the email chain regarding the Vanderhoven merger. It was a correspondence between Mr. Sterling and the CFO of the Vanderhoven Group. Mr. Sterling. The email read, "Our due diligence team has flagged several inconsistencies in your Q3 report regarding the liquidity of your bond holdings. Unless you can provide verified third-party statements by this Friday at noon, we will be forced to pause the merger talks." Friday at noon. That was the deadline. Today was Wednesday. They had less than 48 hours to produce documents they did not have. I read Mr. Sterling's reply. "Rest assured, the documents are being prepared. We are simply reorganizing our portfolio. We look forward to seeing you at the engagement party on Saturday to celebrate our partnership." He was stalling. He was hoping the spectacle of the engagement party, the flash of cameras, and the presence of the perfect humble bride would dazzle them enough to overlook the missing millions. He was betting everything on the image of stability. He was betting on me. I closed the laptop. My hands were steady. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. I knew everything. I knew that Mr. Sterling was a thief stealing from his own son. I knew that Julian was a fool who was being set up to take the fall. I knew that Victoria was complicit, as I found several transfers to her personal design firm labeled as marketing expenses. I knew that the entire family was standing on a trapdoor, and the lever was waiting to be pulled. The sun began to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains. It was 6 a.m. I showered and dressed. I chose a pale blue dress that Julian had picked out for me. It was modest, boring, and made me look harmless. I tied my hair back with a ribbon. I looked in the mirror and practiced my smile. It was a timid, shy smile, the smile of a girl who feels lucky just to be in the room. I went down to breakfast. The dining room was bright and airy, a stark contrast to the dark secrets buried in the hard drive upstairs. Mr. Sterling was at the head of the table, reading the Wall Street Journal. He looked the picture of authority. His suit was crisp. His tie was perfect. No one would guess that he was wiring stolen money to the Caribbean while eating his poached eggs. "Good morning, Elena," he said without looking up. "Good morning," Mr. Sterling, I said softly. Mrs. Sterling was drinking her coffee, looking over a seating chart for the party. We have added 3 more tables, she announced. The governor accepted the invitation, and the Van der Hoeven delegation will be seated at the table directly to your right. Elena, you must be charming. Do not speak about your job. Just smile and talk about how happy you are to be joining a family with such history. I buttered my toast with slow, deliberate movements. Of course, I said, I will do my best not to embarrass you. Julian walked in, looking tired. He kissed my cheek, a wet, sloppy gesture that made me want to scrub my skin with bleach. Morning, babe, he said, dropping into his chair. Did you sleep okay? I slept wonderful, thank you, I lied. I looked at him, really looked at him. He was eating his grapefruit, complaining about the traffic he would face on the way to the office. He was arrogant, entitled, and completely blind. He thought he was the prince of the city. He didn't know he was the sacrifice. Part of me almost felt pity for him, almost. But then Victoria breezed in, throwing her purse on the sideboard. God, Elena, why are you wearing that ribbon? She asked, wrinkling her nose. You look like a farm girl going to the county fair. It is fine. Victoria, Mrs. Sterling snapped. It fits the narrative. Innocent. Pure. The press will eat it up. I touched the ribbon in my hair. I think it is pretty, I said quietly. Victoria rolled her eyes. You would. I took a bite of my toast. The crunch was loud in my ears. I looked at the clock on the wall. 8 a.m. on Thursday. They had 28 hours until the Van der Hoevens demanded the liquidity proof. They had 48 hours until the engagement party. They were acting like masters of the universe, barking orders at the staff, discussing their summer plans in Como, criticizing my fashion choices. They were so busy looking down at me that they didn't notice I was the only one in the room who wasn't falling. I had the flash drive in my pocket. I could feel the sharp corner of it pressing against my hip. I sipped my orange juice. It was freshly squeezed, sweet and cold. Mr. Sterling, I said, breaking the silence. He lowered his newspaper, annoyed. What is it, Elena? I was just wondering, I said, keeping my voice full of wide-eyed innocence. Since we are getting married, Julian mentioned something about signing some papers, like a prenuptial agreement. I just want to make sure I sign whatever you need. I do not want anyone to think I am after your money. Mr. Sterling exchanged a look with his wife, a look of triumph. They thought I was handing them the keys. We will have the lawyers drafted up today, he said, smiling his predator smile. That is very sensible of you. Elena, very mature. I smiled back. I just want to make sure everything is accounted for, I said. The double meaning flew right over their heads. I finished my breakfast, wiped my mouth with the linen napkin, and stood up. I have some errands to run for the party, I said. Take the driver, Mrs. Sterling commanded. Oh, no, I said. I prefer to drive myself. It helps me clear my head. I walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking on the marble floor. I could hear them talking as I left. She is so malleable, Victoria said. It is almost pathetic. At least she is not a problem, Mr. Sterling replied. I walked out the front door and into the bright morning sunlight. I took a deep breath of fresh air. They were right. I was not a problem. I was the solution. But not the solution they wanted. I got into the car and started the engine. I wasn't going to run errands for the party. I was going to make a copy of the flash drive, and then I was going to do a little research on the Van der Hoeven family. If they were looking for a reason to back out of this deal, I was going to make sure they had a dossier thick enough to sink a battleship. The cracks in the empire were already there. All I had to do was pour a little water into them and wait for it to freeze. And winter was coming fast. The Saturday of the engagement party arrived with the humidity of a storm waiting to break. The Sterling estate had been transformed into a theater of the absurd. According to the catering invoices I had seen on the hacked server, they had spent over $200,000 on this single evening. The lawn was covered by a massive silk tent, air-conditioned to a crisp 68 degrees. An orchestra had been flown in from Vienna, There were mountains of caviar and rivers of vintage champagne. It was a desperate, dazzling display intended to blind the creditors. Upstairs in the guest suite, the dress Mrs. Sterling had selected for me hung on the back of the door. It was a tragic thing. A pale, shapeless beige chiffon that looked like a tea bag that had been used twice. It was designed to make me blend into the wallpaper, to make me look like the meek, lucky charity case they were so fond of describing. I looked at it, and then I looked at the garment bag I had brought with me, hidden at the bottom of my suitcase for this exact moment. I took the beige dress off the hanger, folded it neatly, and placed it in the trash can. Tonight, the performance ended. Tonight, the logistics girl was taking the night off. I unzipped my own bag. Inside was a gown I had purchased in Paris 3 years ago. Back when I was closing a deal for a pharmaceutical conglomerate, it was black silk, severe and structural. It had no lace, no frills, no softness. It was cut low in the back and high in the front, fitting like a second skin. It was a dress that did not ask for attention. It commanded submission. I pulled my hair back into a tight, sleek chignon, securing it with diamond pins. I applied my makeup differently, sharp eyeliner, a dark crimson lip, contouring that highlighted the angles of my face rather than softening them. I stepped into my heels, stilettos, 4 inches of steel. I looked in the mirror. Elena the victim was gone. Elena the executioner was staring back. I walked to the door, paused, and checked my clutch. The flash drive was there. I opened the door and walked toward the grand staircase. Below me, the party was in full swing. 300 guests milled about in a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. I spotted the senators, the hedge fund managers, and the socialites, and there, near the ice sculpture, was the Van der Hoeven delegation. They looked unimpressed, holding their glasses with the skepticism of men who know when someone is trying too hard. The orchestra stopped playing a waltz and transitioned into a soft interlude. The timing was accidental, but the effect was theatrical. I stepped onto the landing. The sound of conversation did not stop all at once. It rippled into silence, starting from the people near the stairs and spreading outward like a wave. Heads turned, glasses were lowered. I descended the stairs slowly. I did not hold the banister. I did not look down at my feet. I looked directly into the crowd, scanning faces with a cool, detached amusement. I saw Julian first. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs, holding a glass of scotch. His mouth opened slightly. He blinked, looking around as if checking to see if this was a prank. He did not recognize the woman walking toward him. He was looking for the frizzy-haired girl in the floral print, and instead, he was seeing a woman who looked like she owned the mortgage on his soul. Mrs. Sterling was next to him. Her reaction was more visceral. Her eyes widened, and her face went pale beneath her heavy foundation. She looked at the black dress, then at her son, then back at me. I could see the panic flaring behind her eyes. This was off script. The sheep had shown up in wolf's clothing. I reached the bottom step. Julian hurried forward, his smile tight and strained. "Elena?" he hissed under his breath, grabbing my elbow. "What are you wearing? Where's the dress my mother gave you?" I pulled my arm away. It was a subtle movement, but firm enough that he stumbled slightly. "I burned it," I said. My voice was different. I dropped the soft, breathy register I had used for weeks. I spoke in my natural tone, low, clear, and authoritative. It did not fit the occasion. Julian stared at me. He looked like a computer trying to process code that did not match its operating system. You burned it?" he stammered. "You look tense, darling," I said, reaching out and straightening his bow tie. He flinched. "Relax. The Van der Hovens are watching." I brushed past him and walked straight toward Mrs. Sterling. She recovered her composure quickly, because she was a predator, but I could see the tremor in her hands. "Elena," she said, her voice dripping with venom disguised as sweetness, "you look startling. We were expecting something a bit more traditional." I smiled. It was a sharp smile. "I thought I would dress for the job I want, not the job I have." I said, Isn't that what you always say about ambition, Mrs. Sterling? She narrowed her eyes. What has gotten into you? You are making a scene. I am just mingling, I said. Isn't that what a good hostess does? Before she could stop me, I turned and walked into the crowd. The dynamic of the room shifted. Usually, at these events, the fiancé is a prop, standing silently by her future husband's side, but I moved through the room like a shark in a tank of goldfish. I greeted people by name, names I wasn't supposed to know. I stopped by the table where the CEO of Meridian Bank sat. He was the man holding the majority of the sterling debt. Mr. Henderson, I said, extending my hand, it is a pleasure. I was reading about your bank's exposure to the subprime commercial sector in the journal this morning. Fascinating risk analysis. I hope your liquidity ratios are holding up better than the industry average. Mr. Henderson choked on his canapé. He looked at me with shock. He had expected a vapid greeting. Instead, he got a credit risk assessment. Yes. Well, we are very confident, he managed to say. I am sure you are, I said, maintaining eye contact just a second too long. Confidence is key, until the margin call comes in. Anyway, I left him sweating and moved on. I could feel the Sterling family tracking me. Julian was tailing me from a distance, looking terrified. Victoria was whispering frantically to her mother. They were losing control of the narrative. The naive girl was gone, and in her place was a woman who knew too much. I made my way to the van der Hoven table. This was the moment. The patriarch, Willem van der Hoven, was a man of 70, with eyes like steel bearings. He was speaking in Dutch to his son. I approached them. Goedenavond, meneer van der Hoven. I said in flawless Dutch, Het is een genoegen u eindelijk te ontmoeten. Good evening, Mr. van der Hoven. It is a pleasure to finally meet you. The entire table went silent. Julian, who had just come up behind me to intervene, froze in his tracks. Willem looked at me, surprised. You speak Dutch? I lived in Amsterdam for 2 years while consulting for the Royal Trade Commission. I lied effortlessly, or rather, half-lied. I had consulted for them, but from New York. But he didn't need to know the geography. Consulting? Willem asked, raising an eyebrow. I thought you were in logistics. I laughed. It was a dark, sophisticated sound. Logistics is just a polite word for moving things from where they are to where they need to be. I said, sometimes that is boxes. Sometimes it is capital. Sometimes it is liabilities. Willem studied me. He was a smart man. He saw something in my eyes that interested him. And which one are you moving tonight? He asked. Liabilities, I said softly. Definitely liabilities. Julian grabbed my arm. His grip was painful. Elena, come with me, he said, his voice shaking with rage. We need to take photos near the cake. Now. I looked at Willem. Excuse me, duty calls? I allowed Julian to drag me away toward the corner of the tent, away from the power players. He pulled me behind a large floral arrangement of white hydrangeas. What the hell are you doing? He demanded. His face was red. You are embarrassing us. Why are you speaking Dutch? Since when do you speak Dutch? I pulled my arm free and smoothed the silk of my dress. Since always. Julian, I said calmly. You just never asked. I do not know what game you are playing, he spat, pointing a finger in my face, but you need to stop it. You are ruining everything. You are supposed to be... I stepped closer to him. I was wearing 4-inch heels, which made me almost eye level with him. Supposed to be what? I asked. Stupid? Poor? Grateful? He faltered. He saw the coldness in my eyes, and for the first time, he realized he was in a cage with something dangerous. Just smile, he pleaded, his voice cracking. Just smile and wave and do not say another word. We are about to do the speeches. Father is going to announce the merger. Just stand there and look pretty. Can you do that? I looked at him. This man who had cheated on me. This man who had planned to discard me with a payoff. This man who was actively defrauding investors. I can do that, I said. He exhaled, relieved. He thought he had won. He thought he had reasserted dominance. Good, he said. Fix your lipstick. You look severe. He turned and walked toward the stage where his father was tapping a microphone. I watched him go. I reached into my clutch and touched the cool metal of the flash drive. I looked around the room. The guests were looking toward the stage. The waiters were pausing with their trays. The air was thick with expectation. Mr. Sterling was beaming, looking like the king of the world. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice amplified across the lawn. "Thank you for joining us on this joyous occasion." I began to move. I didn't walk toward the side of the stage where the fiancé was supposed to stand. I walked toward the sound booth. I had spotted the AV technician earlier, a young kid who looked bored and underpaid. "Mr. Sterling continued, "Tonight, we celebrate not just the union of two hearts, but the union of two great families. My son, Julian, has found a woman who represents the core values of the Sterling legacy: humility, integrity, and loyalty." The crowd applauded politely. I reached the sound booth. I slipped a $100 bill onto the mixing board. The kid looked up, startled. "I need to plug this in," I whispered, holding up the flash drive. "It is a surprise slideshow for the groom, a montage of memories." The kid shrugged and took the money. "Sure thing, lady." He took the drive and plugged it into the main laptop controlling the projector. Mr. Sterling was still talking. "And so, before we cut the cake, I would like to invite my future daughter-in-law, Elena, to say a few words. Come up here, my dear." The spotlight swung through the crowd, searching for me. It found me standing by the sound booth. I didn't move toward the stage. I just nodded to the technician. "Hit it," I said. The kid pressed enter. On the massive screen behind Mr. Sterling, a screen meant to display photos of our romance, the image flickered and changed. It wasn't a photo of us kissing. It was a bank statement. The Cayman Islands account. The music stopped. The applause died. "Mr. Sterling turned around to see what everyone was staring at. The silence that followed was not the silence of awe. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hanging at the top of its arc. I picked up a wireless microphone from the table next to the booth. I switched it on. "Hello, everyone," I said. My voice echoed through the tent, clear and sharp as broken glass. "Mr. Sterling looked at me, his face turning a shade of purple I had never seen before. I walked out from the shadows of the booth and into the center aisle. "I think there has been a misunderstanding about who I am," I said, walking slowly toward the stage. "And I think it is time we cleared the ledger." The show was over. The reality was about to begin. The silence in the tent was absolute. It was not the respectful silence of an audience listening to a toast. It was the suffocating vacuum that occurs just before a building collapses. Behind me, on the 20-foot screen meant for sentimental engagement photos, the bank statement from the Cayman Islands glowed in high definition. It showed a balance of $12,400,000, money that had been siphoned directly from the Sterling Industries Employee Pension Fund. I stood in the center of the aisle, the microphone cold and heavy in my hand. I looked at Mr. Sterling on the stage. He was frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock, his eyes darting from me to the screen and back again. He looked at the technician in the booth, making a slashing motion across his throat to cut the feed. But the kid just adjusted his headphones and looked away. $100 buys a lot of selective blindness. "Thank you for that lovely introduction, Richard," I said. My voice was amplified, crisp and steady, bouncing off the silk walls of the tent. "You spoke so eloquently about legacy, about values, about the importance of family." I took a step closer to the stage. The guests parted for me, their faces masks of confusion and growing horror. They were beginning to realize this was not a technical glitch. "You know, when I first came to this house, I was told that I had a lot to learn." I continued, keeping my tone conversational. "I was told that I was naive, that I did not understand how the world of the elite worked, that I was just a girl from Ohio who should be grateful for the scraps thrown from the Sterling table." I signaled to the booth with a slight raise of my hand. "Next slide, please." The screen flickered, the bank statement disappeared, replaced by a series of scanned invoices. These were the Apex Strategic Consulting bills. I pointed to the screen without looking at it. For those of you in the back who cannot see clearly, these are invoices for $42,000 a month paid to a company that does not exist. A company that is registered to a post office box in Delaware owned by none other than our host, Richard Sterling. A gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw the CEO of Meridian Bank stand up, his face draining of color. He was doing the math in his head. He was realizing that the collateral for his loans was being stolen by the borrower. "You cannot do this!" Mrs. Sterling shrieked. She lunged toward me from the side of the stage, her composure shattering into a million jagged pieces. "Security, get her out of here. She is crazy. She is lying." I turned to face her. I did not flinch. "Am I?" I asked. I signaled the booth again. The screen changed. This time, it was not a financial document. It was an email. The font was large enough for everyone to read. From Julian Sterling to Richard Sterling. Subject: the wedding timeline. I do not think I can stomach playing house with the peasant for that long. Is the Vanderhoven girl ready? The gasp turned into a murmur of shock. I saw women covering their mouths. I saw men shaking their heads. I looked at Julian. He was standing near the cake table, his face as white as the frosting. He looked like he had been shot in the chest. He was staring at the screen, reading his own words, realizing that his private arrogance was now public record. "You called me a peasant. Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register that the microphone picked up perfectly. "You and your mother sat in your parlor and laughed about how easy I was to control. You said poor people are easily distracted by shiny objects." I raised my left hand, letting the massive yellow diamond catch the stage lights. "Well, I am looking at the shiny object. Julian, but I am not distracted." Julian took a step forward, his hands trembling. "Elena, please, stop. We can talk about this." "There is nothing to talk about," I said. I turned my attention to the table on the right. "Mr. Vanderhoven," I said, addressing the Dutch billionaire directly, "you asked for proof of liquidity by Friday. You wanted to know if the Sterling bond holdings were secure before you signed the merger." I signaled the booth. The screen shifted to the inventory reports I had analyzed, side-by-side comparisons of the shipping manifests and the warehouse storage logs. "They are not secure," I stated. "They do not exist. The warehouses in New Jersey are empty. The steel they claim to have, it was sold 4 months ago to cover the interest payments on the bridge loans. The Sterling Empire is not a fortress. Sir, it is a hollow shell. They were using my engagement, using me, to buy enough time to get your signature on that check." Willem Vanderhoven stood up slowly. He looked at the screen, studying the numbers with the cold precision of a man who does not forgive betrayal. He looked at Mr. Sterling, who was now sweating so profusely that his shirt was clinging to his chest. "Richard," Willem said, his voice booming without a microphone, "is this true?" Richard Sterling stammered. It is a fabrication. She is she is mentally unstable. Look at her. She is trying to ruin us." Willem looked at me. He looked at the dress I was wearing, the black silk armor of a woman who had come to war. He looked at my eyes. He saw no insanity there. He saw only the cold, hard truth. "I think the only thing she has ruined is your lie," Willem said. He turned to his delegation. "We gaan," he commanded in Dutch. "We are leaving." The Vanderhoven group stood up in unison. They did not look back. They marched out of the tent, their exit signaling the death knell of the Sterling future. The room descended into chaos. The reporters, who had been invited to cover a fairy tale, were now witnessing a massacre. Flashbulbs erupted like strobe lights, capturing the panic on Mrs. Sterling's face, the defeat on Mr. Sterling's posture, and the utter destruction of Julian. I walked toward the stage stairs. I climbed them slowly, the sound of my heels echoing on the wood. Mr. Sterling backed away from me. He looked terrified. He looked small. You thought because I came from nothing. I was nothing. I said to him, standing so close I could smell the fear on him, you thought my lack of money meant a lack of intelligence. You forgot the most important rule of business. Richard, never underestimate the person holding the ledger. I turned to the crowd one last time. I am not a logistics clerk. I announced, I am a forensic accountant, and I have already sent a full copy of these files to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the District Attorney's Office. The police are on their way. I looked down at Julian. He had collapsed onto a chair, his head in his hands. He was weeping, not the dignified tears of a tragedy, but the ugly, snot-nosed sobbing of a child who has been caught. I walked down the stairs and approached him. I reached for my left hand. I pulled the ring off my finger. It slid off easily, just as Mrs. Sterling had feared it would. I dropped the ring into his champagne glass. It made a sharp clink as it hit the crystal, splashing the expensive liquid onto his tuxedo. You can keep the ring. Julian, I said, you are going to need the bail money. I turned my back on them. The tent was buzzing with the sound of 300 people realizing they were witnessing the end of an era. I walked down the center aisle, the path clearing for me as if I were royalty. And in a way, I was. I was the queen of the ashes I had just created. Victoria screamed something at me from the sidelines, something about being a witch, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. Blue and red lights began to flash against the silk fabric of the tent walls. I did not stop. I did not look back. I walked out of the tent and into the cool night air. The humidity had broken. A light rain was beginning to fall, washing away the heat of the day. I walked toward my car, leaving the screams and the sirens behind me. I had come to their house wearing a mask of poverty. I was leaving it having stripped them of everything they valued. They wanted to see who I really was. Now they knew. The arrival of the authorities was not dramatic in the way movies depict it. There were no guns drawn, no shouting through megaphones, no helicopters circling overhead. Instead, it was a procession of grim efficiency. 2 squad cars and an unmarked sedan pulled up the gravel driveway, their tires crunching over the stones that had been raked to perfection by the gardening staff just hours earlier. The red and blue lights reflected off the wet grass, mixing with the soft amber glow of the garden lanterns to create a surreal, disorienting strobe effect. I stood by the entrance of the tent, watching the structure of the Sterling Empire disintegrate in real time. Inside the tent, the reaction was chemical. It was as if a drop of oil had hit a bowl of water. The separation was instant and absolute. The 300 guests, senators, heirs, and titans of industry were not just leaving, they were fleeing the contamination. I watched as long-standing alliances evaporated in seconds. Men who had played golf with Richard Sterling for 20 years were suddenly checking their watches, turning their backs, and frantically signaling for their valets. Mr. Henderson, the CEO of Meridian Bank, was already on his phone near the ice sculpture. His face was a mask of panic. Freeze the credit lines. I heard him bark into his device. Yes, all of them. The operating accounts, the personal trusts, everything. I do not care what the contract says. Initiate the clawback clause immediately. We have exposure of $40 million here. I want a lien on the property by morning. $40 million. That was the sound of the guillotine blade finally hitting the neck. Mrs. Sterling was attempting to hold court near the buffet, but her court had dissolved. She reached out to grab the arm of a woman passing by. Mrs. Calloway, the head of the city's largest charity board. Martha, please, Mrs. Sterling pleaded, her voice cracking. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. You know us. You know we are good people. Mrs. Calloway pulled her arm away with a look of pure revulsion. She smoothed the fabric of her sleeve as if Mrs. Sterling's touch had left a stain. I know that my husband lost half his pension fund in your husband's bond scheme. Eleanor, Mrs. Calloway said coldly, do not speak to me. Do not ever speak to me again. Mrs. Sterling recoiled, her back hitting the edge of the table. A tray of champagne flutes wobbled and crashed to the floor. the sound of breaking glass punctuating the end of her social standing. She looked around the room, searching for a sympathetic eye, but found only backs turned against her. The isolation was total. In the world of the elite, bankruptcy is a sin, but fraud is an excommunication. I watched Victoria trying to push her way through the crowd toward the exit, likely trying to get to her car before the police could question her. She was intercepted by a uniformed officer. "Ms. Sterling?" the officer asked, stepping in her path. "I didn't do anything," Victoria shrieked, her voice shrill and terrified. "It was my father. I just work in marketing. I do not know anything about the accounts." The officer remained impassive. "We have a warrant to secure all electronic devices associated with the company directors. We need you to stay here, ma'am." She began to cry, loud, ugly sobs that caused her mascara to run down her cheeks in black rivulets. The arrogance that had allowed her to mock my clothes and my background was gone, replaced by the pathetic reality of a child who has never had to face a consequence in her life. And then there was Richard Sterling. He was standing on the stage, alone. The microphone was still in his hand, hanging limply by his side. Two detectives in suits were walking up the stairs toward him. He looked small, without the adoration of the crowd, without the shield of his wealth. He was just an old man in a tuxedo that was suddenly too tight around the collar. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He just slumped, the air leaving his body as the reality of his future, indictments, trials, prison cells, settled onto his shoulders. I turned to walk toward the parking lot. My work here was done. I had not screamed. I had not thrown a drink in anyone's face. I had simply turned on the lights, and the roaches were scattering. "Elena." The voice was desperate, ragged. I paused near the valet stand but did not turn around immediately. I heard running footsteps on the gravel. Julian caught up to me, breathless. His hair was disheveled, wet from the light rain that was now falling steadily. His tuxedo jacket was stained with champagne. He looked like a ghost of the man who had stood in the parlor 3 days ago, swirling his scotch and calling me a peasant. "Elena, wait," he gasped, reaching for my hand but stopping short of touching me. "You cannot just leave." I turned slowly. I looked at him with the same clinical detachment I would use to examine a tax return with a math error. "There is nothing left to stay for." "Julian," I said calmly. He stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Why? Why did you do it like this? You could have just broken up with me. You could have just left. Why did you have to burn it all down?" I tilted my head, studying him. He still didn't get it. He still thought this was about a breakup. He still thought this was a romantic squabble gone wrong. "I didn't burn it down." I said, "It was already burning. I just showed everyone the smoke." "But you ruined us," he cried, his voice rising in hysteria. "My father is being arrested. The banks are pulling the loans. Do you have any idea what you have done? We are going to lose the house. We are going to lose everything." "Yes," I said. "You are? How can you be so cold?" he asked, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "I thought you loved me. I thought you were sweet. I thought—" He trailed off. "You thought I was weak. I finished for him." I took a step closer to him. The rain was cold on my bare shoulders, but I didn't feel it. "You didn't love me. Julian, you didn't even know me. You saw a costume. You saw a cheap dress and a quiet voice, and you assumed that meant I was lesser than you. You assumed it meant I was stupid. You assumed it meant I was disposable." "I never said you were disposable," he protested weakly. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a printout of the email he had sent his father. I held it up. "I do not think I can stomach playing house with the peasant for that long." I read aloud. He flinched as if I had slapped him. "That is the price of contempt." "Julian," I said, tucking the paper back into my bag, "when you treat people like they are nothing, you miss the moment they become something dangerous. You were so busy looking down on me that you didn't notice I was the one holding the match." He looked at the ground. He was shaking. "I can fix this," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "I can talk to the lawyers. We can cut a deal. Maybe if you testify that. I laughed. It was a short, dry sound. There is no deal. Julian, the flash drive is already with the authorities. The forensic trail is airtight. I made sure of it. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw the dawn of true understanding in his eyes. He realized that I wasn't just a girl who had gotten lucky with a computer. He realized I was a professional who had executed a demolition. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Really?" "I am exactly who you needed me to be," I said. "The auditor." I turned away from him. "Elena," he called out, his voice cracking. "Please, I am sorry. I am sorry for everything. Please do not leave me here alone." I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I walked to the housekeeper's old sedan, which was parked amidst the Ferraris and Bentleys. It looked out of place, humble and rusted, much like I had looked when I first arrived. But as I unlocked the door, I knew the truth. This car was the only honest thing in the entire zip code. I got in and started the engine. Through the rear-view mirror, I saw Julian standing in the rain, watching me. He looked small. He looked defeated. He looked like a man who was realizing that the world he thought he owned was made of glass, and he was standing in the middle of a hailstorm without a helmet. I put the car in gear. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. Revenge, contrary to popular belief, is not sweet. It is neutral. It is simply the restoration of balance. They had taken value from the world through lies and theft. I had returned the balance to zero. I drove down the long, winding driveway, past the iron gates that were meant to keep the common people out. The gates were open now, allowing the police cars to stream in. I turned onto the main road, the darkness stretching out before me. I was not Elena the fiancé. I was not Elena the logistics clerk. I was myself again, and for the first time in months, the air in my lungs felt clean. The rain had stopped by the time I pulled into the underground garage of my actual apartment building in downtown Manhattan. It was not the drafty, rented studio in Queens that I had taken Julian to visit, the one I had staged with secondhand furniture and peeling paint to test his character. This was my home. It was a penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, paid for in cash 3 years ago after I successfully restructured a failing tech giant in Silicon Valley. I parked the rusted sedan I used for my Elena the logistics girl persona in the visitor spot. Tomorrow, I would have it towed to a scrapyard. I walked to my reserved spot where my real car sat under a dust cover, a vintage Aston Martin that I drove only on Sundays, simply because I appreciated the engineering, not because I needed anyone to see me in it. I took the private elevator up to the 42nd floor. As the doors slid open, I was greeted not by cold marble and judgment, but by the warm, minimalist sanctuary I had built for myself. My cat, a rescue named Buster, greeted me with a sleepy meow. I picked him up, burying my face in his fur. The mask was off. My name is not just Elena. My name is Elena Vance, and I am the founder and lead partner of Vance & Associates, a boutique forensic accounting firm that specializes in high-stakes corporate fraud and asset recovery. I do not work in a warehouse moving boxes. I work in boardrooms moving millions of dollars, usually away from corrupt executives and back into the hands of the shareholders they tried to cheat. I poured myself a glass of water, tap water, because I do not need imported mineral water to feel important, and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my assistant, Sarah. "The news is breaking. CNN just ran the Chiron. Sterling Industries raid. Do you want me to issue a statement?" I typed back a single word. No. I did not need the credit. I did not need the fame. The destruction of the Sterling facade was not a PR stunt for my firm. It was a personal exorcism. Over the next 2 weeks, the fallout was catastrophic. The newspapers called it the wedding crash. It was the kind of scandal that the public devoured with voracious appetites. Richard Sterling was indicted on 12 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Mrs. Sterling, the woman who had sneered at my poverty, was photographed leaving the estate in tears as federal agents seized her jewelry, her art collection, and yes, even her beloved Limoges china. The estate itself was foreclosed upon within 7 days. It turned out they hadn't paid the mortgage in 8 months. The bank took everything. And Julian tried to reach me. 3 days after the party, my building's security called up to the penthouse. "Ms. Vance," the doorman said, his voice hesitant. "There is a man down here. He says his name is Julian Sterling. He says he knows you. He looks like he has been sleeping in his car. He is demanding to see Elena from logistics." I stood by the intercom, listening to the static. I closed my eyes and pictured him. I pictured the way he had looked at me when he thought I was beneath him. The pity, the condescension, the secret smirk he shared with his sister. I pictured him holding Isabella's hand, planning to pay me off with $50,000. He wanted to apologize, or maybe he wanted to borrow money, or maybe, in his twisted narcissism, he wanted to blame me for ruining his life, refusing to accept that he had handed me the matches himself. He wanted closure, but closure is a luxury, and he was bankrupt. "Tell him," I said into the intercom, my voice steady and cold, "that there is no one here by that description. Tell him Elena, the logistics clerk, never existed, and tell him that Ms. Vance is currently billing $500 an hour and does not take pro bono cases from ex-fiancés." There was a pause. "Understood. Ms. Vance." I walked to the window and looked down, 42 stories below. I saw a small figure being escorted away from the building entrance by 2 large security guards. He stopped for a moment, looking up at the tower, searching the windows. He looked lost. He was finally experiencing what he had forced me to simulate for months, the feeling of being small in a world designed to crush you. I turned away from the window. The reason I chose to live simply, to wear clearance rack clothes, and drive a beat-up car when I met Julian, was not just a test, it was a philosophy. My grandfather, a man who worked with his hands until the day he died, taught me that your value is not what you wear, it is what you are. He told me that money is a tool, like a hammer. You can use it to build a house, or you can use it to hit people over the head. The Sterlings used it as a weapon. They used it to separate themselves from humanity, to convince themselves they were a different species. But when you strip away the money, what is left? For the Sterlings, there was nothing left. No loyalty, no love, no integrity, just a hollow space where a soul should have been. For me, stripped of my fake poverty, I was still Elena. I was resilient. I was sharp. I was capable. I walked into my office and sat down at my desk. I had a new case file waiting for me. A pharmaceutical company in Chicago was suspected of inflating their clinical trial results. Another dragon to slay, another lie to dismantle. I opened the file. I didn't feel angry at Julian anymore. Anger requires emotional investment. I felt indifferent. He was a lesson I had learned, a variable I had solved, and now he was a closed account. The world is full of people who think that power comes from a last name or a bank balance. They think that if they stand on a pedestal and look down on others, they are tall. They do not realize that the pedestal is fragile, and the people they are stepping on are the ones holding it up. I picked up my pen. I had walked into the lion's den wearing a lamb's wool coat. They thought they were going to eat. They didn't know they were choking. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. My grandfather was right. The loudest man in the room is usually the weakest, and the quietest girl at the table is the one you should be afraid of. Real value does not need an audience. Real power does not need to shout. And the truth, no matter how much gold you pile on top of it, will always, eventually, break through the surface. I am Elena Vance. I acted like a poor and naive girl, and because I did, I saw exactly who they were. And then, I showed them exactly who I was. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment down below with your location, and let's share our thoughts on the price of arrogance. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people who need to hear the truth.